Europe, where the fall of a capital city often ended wars, that in America continued. Even after the loss of major settlements such as Philadelphia, the seat of Congress, New York and Charleston. 310. British power was reliant on the Royal Navy, whose dominance allowed them to resupply their own expeditionary forces while preventing access to enemy ports. However, the majority of the American population was agrarian, rather than urban, supported by the French Navy and blockade runners based in the Dutch Caribbean. Their economy was able to survive. 311. The geographical size of the colonies and limited manpower meant the British could not simultaneously conduct military operations and occupy territory without local support. Debate persists over whether their defeat was inevitable. One British statesman described it as like trying to conquer a map. 312. While Filling argues Patriot victory was nothing short of a miracle. 313. Ellis suggests the odds always favored Americans, especially after Howe squandered the chance of a decisive British success in 1776, an opportunity that would never come again. 314. The U.S. military history speculates the additional commitment of 10,000 fresh troops in 1780 would have placed British victory within the realm of possibility. 315. British Army. Portrait of the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Thomas Gage in dress uniform. Sir Thomas Gage, British Commander, 1763–1775. The expulsion of France from North America in 1763 led to a drastic reduction in British troop levels in the colonies. In 1775, there were only 8,500 regular soldiers among a civilian population of 2.8 million. 316. The bulk of military resources in the Americas were focused on defending Sugar Islands in the Caribbean. Jamaica alone generated more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined. 317. With the end of the 7 Years' War, the permanent army in Britain was also cut back, which resulted in administrative difficulties when the war began a decade later. 318. Over the course of the war, there were 4 separate British commanders-in-chief, the first of whom was Thomas Gage, appointed in 1763. High's initial focus was establishing British rule in former French areas of Canada. Rightly or wrongly, many in London blamed the revolt on his failure to take firm action earlier, and he was relieved after the heavy losses incurred at Bunker Hill. 319. His replacement was Sir William Howe, a member of the Whig faction in Parliament who opposed the policy of coercion advocated by Lord North. Cornwallis, who later surrendered at Yorktown, was one of many senior officers who initially refused to serve in North America. 320. The 1775 campaign showed the British overestimated the capabilities of their own troops and underestimated the colonial militia, requiring a reassessment of tactics and strategy. 321. However, it allowed the Patriots to take the initiative and British authorities rapidly lost control over every colony. 322. Howe's responsibility is still debated. Despite receiving large numbers of reinforcements, Bunker Hill seems to have permanently affected his self-confidence, and lack of tactical flexibility meant he often failed to follow up opportunities. 323. Many of his decisions were attributed to supply problems, such as the delay in launching the New York campaign and failure to pursue Washington's beaten army. 324. Having lost the confidence of his subordinates, he was recalled after Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. 325. Portrait of the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir William Howe in dress uniform. Sir William Howe, British Commander, 1775 1778 following the failure of the Carlisle Commission. British policy changed from treating the Patriots as subjects who needed to be reconciled to enemies who hard to be defeated. 326. In 1778, Howe was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton, appointed instead of Carleton, who was considered overly cautious. 327. Regarded as an expert on tactics and strategy. 325. Like his predecessors, Clinton was handicapped by chronic supply issues. 328. As a result, he was largely inactive in 1779 and much of 1780. In October 1780, he warned Germain of fatal consequences if matters did not improve. 329. In addition, Clinton's strategy was compromised by conflict with political superiors in London and his colleagues in North America, especially Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot, replaced in early 1781 by Rodney. 252. He was neither notified nor consulted when Germain approved Cornwallis' invasion of Thesuth in 1781 and delayed sending him reinforcements, believing the bulk of Washington's army was still outside New York City. 330. After the surrender at Yorktown, Clinton was relieved by Carleton, whose major task was to oversee the evacuation of Loyalist armed British troops from Savannah, Charleston, and New York City. 331. German troops. Portrait of the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Henry Clinton in dress uniform. Sir Henry Clinton, British Commander, 1778-1782. During the 18th century, all states commonly hired foreign soldiers, especially Britain. During the 7 Years' War, they comprised 10% of the British Army, and their use caused little debate. 332. When it became clear additional troops were needed to suppress the revolt in America, it was decided to employ professional German soldiers. There were several reasons for this, including public sympathy for the Patriot cause, an historical reluctance to expand the British Army, and the time needed to recruit and train new regiments. 333. An alternate source was readily available in the Holy Roman Empire, where many smaller states had a long tradition of renting their armies to the highest bidder. The most important was Hesse-Kassel, known as the mercenary state. 334. The first supply agreements were signed by the North administration in late 1775. Over the next decade, more than 40,000 Germans fought in North America, Gibraltar, South Africa and India, of whom 30,000 served in the American War. 335. Often generically referred to as Hessians, they included men from many other states including Hanover and Brunswick. 336. Sir Henry Clinton recommended recruiting Russian troops, whom he rated very highly, having seen them in action against the Ottomans. However, negotiations with Catherine the Great made little progress. 337. Unlike previous wars, their use led to intense political debate in Britain, France, and even Germany, where Frederick the Great refused to provide passage through his territories for troops hired for the American War. 338. In March 1776, the agreements were challenged in Parliament by Whigs who objected to coercion in general, and the use of foreign soldiers to subdue British subjects. 339. The debates were covered in detail by American newspapers, which reprinted key speeches, and in May 1776 they received copies of the treaties themselves, provided by British sympathizers. These were smuggled into North America from London by George Merchant, a recently released American prisoner. 340. The prospect of foreign German soldiers being used in the colonies bolstered support for independence more so than taxation and other acts combined. The king was accused of declaring war on his own subjects, leading to the idea there were now two separate governments. 341, 342. By apparently showing Britain was determined to go to war, it made hopes of reconciliation seem naive and hopeless, while the employment of what was regarded as foreign mercenaries became one of the charges leveled against George III in the Declaration of Independence. 338. The Hessian reputation within Germany for brutality also increased support for the patriot cause among German-American immigrants. 343. Hessian troops surrender after Battle of Trenton, December 1776. Hessian troops surrender after Battle of Trenton, December 1776. The presence of over 150,000 German Americans meant both sides felt the German soldiers might be persuaded to desert. One reason Clinton suggested employing Russians was that he felt they were less likely to defect. When the first German troops arrived on Staten Island in August 1776, Congress approved the printing of handbills promising land and citizenship to any willing to join the Patriot cause. The British launched a counter-campaign claiming deserters could well be executed for meddling in a war that was not theirs. 344. Desertion among the Germans occurred throughout the year, with the highest rate of desertion occurring during the time between the surrender at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. 345. German regiments were central to the British war effort. Of the estimated 30,000 sent to America, some 13,000 became casualties. 346. Revolution as Civil War. Loyalists. Wealthy loyalists convinced the British government that most of the colonists were sympathetic toward the crown. Winking sad smiley. 347. Consequently, British military planners relied on recruiting loyalists, but had trouble recruiting sufficient numbers as the Patriots had widespread support. 276. Nevertheless, they continued to deceive themselves on their level of American support as late as 1780, a year before hostilities ended. 348. Approximately 25,000 loyalists fought for the British throughout the war. 29. Although loyalists constituted about 20% of the colonial population, 77, they were concentrated in distinct communities. Many of them lived among large plantation owners in the Tidewater region and South Carolina who produced cash crops in tobacco and indigo comparable to global markets in Caribbean sugar. 77. A wounded British officer falls from his horse after being struck by gunfire. Another British officer to his right puts his hands forwards to support the wounded rider. Troops skirmish in the background. Men lie dead at the rider's feet. Loyalist militia routed by Patriot militia at Kings Mountain withdrew into South Carolina. Victory raised American morale. When the British began probing the back country in 1777, 1778, they were faced with a major problem. Any significant level of organized loyalist activity required a continued presence of British regulars. 349. The available manpower that the British had in America was insufficient to protect loyalist territory and counter American offensives. 350. The loyalist militias in the South were constantly defeated by neighboring Patriot militia. The most critical combat between the two partisan militias was at the Battle of Kings Mountain. The Patriot victory irreversibly impaired any further loyalist militia capability in the South. 239. When the early war policy was administered by General William Howe, the Crown's need to maintain loyalist support prevented it from using the traditional revolt suppression methods. 351. The British cause suffered when their troops ransacked local homes during an aborted attack on Charleston in 1779 that enraged both patriots and loyalists. 227. After Congress rejected the Carlisle Peace Commission in 1778 and Westminster turned to hard war during Clinton's command, neutral colonists in the Carolinas often allied with the Patriots whenever brutal combat broke out between Tories and Whigs. 352. Conversely, Loyalists gained support when Patriots intimidated suspected Tories by destroying property or tarring and feathering. 353. A Loyalist militia unit, the British Legion, provided some of the best troops in British service that it received a commission in the British Army. Sad Smiley. 354. It was a mixed regiment of 250 dragoons and 200 infantry supported by batteries of flying artillery. 355. It was commanded by Banastre Tarleton and gained a fearsome reputation in the colonies for brutality and needless slaughter. 356. In May 1779 the British Legion was one of 5 regiments that formed the American establishment. 357. Women. Women played various roles during the Revolutionary War. They often accompanied their husbands when permitted to do so. For example, throughout the war Martha Washington was known to visit and provide aid to her husband George at various American camps. 358, and Frederica Charlotte Reed Easel documented the Saratoga campaign. 359. Women often accompanied armies as camp followers to sell goods and perform necessary tasks in hospitals and camps. They were a necessary part of 18th century armies and numbered in the thousands during the war. 360. Scene of Nancy Morgan Hart on the left with musket raised and child hiding behind her skirts, and behind, on the right 2 Loyalist soldiers are lying on the floor, and 3 are raising their hands defensively in alarm. Nancy Morgan Hart single-handedly captured 6 Loyalist soldiers who had barged into her home to ransack it. Women also assumed military roles, aside from military tasks like treating the wounded or setting up camp. Some dressed as men to directly support combat, fight, or act as spies on both sides of the Revolutionary War. 361. Anna Maria Lane joined her husband in the army and wore men's clothes by the time the Battle of Germantown happened. The Virginia General Assembly later cited her bravery. She fought while dressed as a man and performed extraordinary military services. And received a severe wound at the Battle of Germantown, with courage of a soldier. 362. On the 26th of April, 1777, Sybil Udington wrote to alert militia forces of Putnam County, New York, and Danbury, Connecticut, to warn them of the British approach. She has been called the female Paul Revere. 363. A few others disguised themselves as men. Deborah Sampson fought until her gender was discovered and discharged as a result. Sally St. Clair was killed in action during the war. 362. African Americans. 1975 stamp commemorating Salem Poor Black Patriot cited for bravery at Bunker Hill when war began. The population of the 13 colonies included an estimated 500,000 slaves, predominantly used as labor on southern plantations. 364. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that promised freedom to any patriot-owned slaves willing to bear arms. Although the announcement helped to fill a temporary manpower shortage, white loyalist prejudice meant recruits were eventually redirected to non-combatant roles. The loyalists' motive was to deprive patriot planters of labor rather than to end slavery. Loyalist-owned slaves were returned. 365. The 1779 Philipsburg Proclamation issued by Clinton extended the offer of freedom to patriot-owned slaves throughout the